Hey developers, so today we have something cool. We are going to look at an amazing developer roadmap going from front end to back end, and then we'll also look at DevOps. So this roadmap encompasses a lot of things. It actually has some ideas and some recommendations. I'm going to tell you my thoughts if I agree or disagree with those recommendations, and kind of tell you what I think you guys should do. Now, being a developer nowadays is pretty difficult. There are so many things you can do. There's so many things you can specialize in. So it's cool to look at one place where you can get an idea of all the different paths you can take. And I think this repository really does it. Also, I want to give a quick shout out to my friend Adrian. He actually did a similar video. So if you want to learn more about his ideas, I'll put a link in the description too. But let's go ahead and get into it. Oh yeah, and a quick plug, if you guys are interested in learning Vue.js, React, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Go ahead and click that like button. And also, I also love to do courses and to teach people. So I put a link in the description below. If you sign up for my mailing list, you'll be notified anytime I have a new course coming out, when I have a new video coming out. I'll keep you in the know, and I give amazing discounts. So yeah, so make sure you check out that link in the description and you can sign up there. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. So I'll give props for props is due. This repository is by Kamran Ahmed, and he has his own website called roadmap.sh where he talks about different roadmaps. He even has a YouTube channel now. So what's cool about this is he's been updating it and changing it. You can actually push a pull request and add more options to it, but it has these pretty intricate paths which you can take for as a developer. And so I'm going to bring one up here. So here is his backend one. You can see here he has images for it. I want to start with the front end, and it has his personal recommendations, his alternative options, and then order in roadmap not strict, learn anytime, and I would not recommend. So yeah, let's just deep dive into it. Make sure we could see it here. Make it a little bigger. I think you can definitely start learning the basics of how the internet works and domain names and hosting and things like that. I would say at a really high level is what you need to learn at the start. I would not go down the rabbit hole of learning, every intricacy between how DNS works, how domain names work, how hosting works. Just enough to get by. I think this is a really nice to have when you first start, but you don't really have to know it in depth. So just some basics of how the internet works. Then next on his roadblock here, or his roadmap, is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I think I would 100% agree. These are the basic fundamentals you need to know to learn web development and to become a front-end developer. So the basics, this is kind of a loaded word. What are the basics of HTML? HTML isn't necessarily that complicated, but you could deep dive into accessibility, things like that. Some people may assume accessibility is the basics. Obviously, it has another part for that, but maybe just knowing what tags are, I guess. Writing semantic HTML, he has kind of a gray check box that you can learn at any time. I would recommend learning semantic HTML from the beginning. I've actually done interviews with developers who had no idea what semantic HTML even was or is. So I think this is a must know. Forms of validation, conventions and best practices. Yes and no, I would say. You can learn how to do forms in HTML. I think that's 100% necessary. Once again, what kind of best practices are we talking about in HTML? The SEO basics, I don't really think is that important, so I would agree. And he has learned the basics of CSS, making layouts, responsive design, floats, positioning, display, box grid, CSS grid, flexbox. Yes, I would say all of these are extremely important. When I'm interviewing people, I definitely want to make sure they know about flexbox, CSS grid, box model. They don't have to know everything about both flexbox and CSS grid, but at least know one really well, I would say is a good idea. Floats are kind of old and people don't use them anymore, so I wouldn't necessarily say you have to know floats, but obviously, basic positioning, display is important. And media queries, definitely important there. So on the JavaScript side, syntax and basic constructs, learn DOM manipulation, learn fetch API Ajax, ES6 modular JavaScript, understand the concepts, hoisting, event bubbling, scope, prototype, shadow DOM, strict. This is a lot to learn for JavaScript, and I think really when you first get started, I don't think you necessarily have to know every one of these. Obviously, ES6 is pretty important in learning the Fetch API, but maybe you're at a company that's not going to use the Fetch API. Maybe they're going to be using Axios everywhere. Maybe, I mean, that might not be that important. Obviously, understanding how Ajax works is important, though. DOM manipulation. Once again, you may be at a company that uses straight DOM manipulations, and you have to add documents and delete nodes. But you're probably going to be in a company that uses React or Vue or Angular, and it's not that important. Syntax-based constructs, yes. Understand the concept between hoisting, event bubbling, scope. These are important for interviews, but you probably won't use them in your company much at all, especially if you're using any sort of framework. Obviously, scope, you probably want to understand. Shadow DOM, like, just know what it is. But I think these are more like gotcha interview questions than things that you might use every day. Like, when I interview people, I try to ask them questions about things they'll probably use every day. So if you don't understand how to use Flex or Grid and you're trying to position something and you only know floats, I mean, that would be a red flag to me. Version control systems, which ones you should use. Basically, you just Git, web security, repo hosting. I like how he loves GitHub, but GitLab and Bitbucket are just like, well, you can use those. I think all three should have a check mark. They're all great. You're going to go to companies that really love GitHub, but then you might go to some companies that are on the GitLab or Bitbucket circuit. I mean, all three of them are fine. I can't really make a recommendation between all three. I guess I use GitHub more often, so maybe that would, if I had to use a recommendation for there. But all three are really good. And he does have a green check mark, which means just an alternate and that are just as good. Basic usage of Git. Yeah, I would definitely recommend people to know that. Web security knowledge. Get at least basic knowledge of these HTTPS content cores. This would be more for the backend, I would say, to understand some of these things. You'll probably be working with a backend developer who will kind of put some security in place, and hopefully he'll explain that security to you as a front-end developer and what you need to do, especially if you're using authentication or authorization and what you should be passing. Kind of understanding the basics of this is understandable. I kind of agree. I don't think it's super something you need to know right away. Package managers. I'm a big NPM fan. Yarn, though, those are both great. CSS architecture. With modern frameworks, CSS and JS, you don't have to worry about these anymore, but still would be a good idea from there. So I feel like this is definitely in the React mindset, because he talks about CSS and JS, which is the only framework that really does that is React. So in Vue, the CSS is completely separate in its own separate block in your single file component. In React, it's typically in its own file, and then in Angular, it's in its own file, but in React, I know you can kind of mix in the JavaScript and the CSS together, or you can use something like styled components. I would say BEM, I don't even know. I do know BEM. I think that would probably be good to learn, but just having a simple way of architecting your CSS that makes sense, that you have the right comments, something that you can repeat throughout your apps, I think that's fine. Having some structure of something of some sort is fine. And if you want to use BEM, that's good. CSS preprocessor, Sass, post CSS. Once again, he says it's not as important, but I think Sass is still, I think you should learn Sass, at least the basics of it. I would put a purple check mark there. Build tools, linters and formatters, Prettier, ESLint, build tools, task runners, NPM scripts, module bundlers. All this is like nice to know, but I don't think you really need to know it. He says you should learn Webpack. I don't think you really need to learn Webpack unless you're in a very sophisticated organization that's overriding their Webpack configs. And even then, you could probably just spend a day or two and learn Webpack. Just knowing what these are is probably good enough. Probably don't need to learn them at all. Honestly, I do. Some organizations will have their own Prettier files and linting standards, and you'll just need to make sure you format with that and you know what they are. And they're usually pretty easy to set up in your IDE. So pick a framework. So this is interesting right here. So usually I'm a big Vue fan, so I would say I'll give the purple check mark here to Vue for the one I would recommend. I think definitely this is more of a React-centric front-end diagram. So I would say all three of these you can give purple check marks. React, Angular, Vue are great ways to go. And I would put Svelte in there too. I don't know. He does not have Svelte. I think Svelte would also get like a great check mark, which or a green check mark, which would be a nice one to know because I think those are really the big four nowadays and people are talking about it. Redux, MobX, yep, that's so if you're using some state management system. Once again, I don't think you really need to learn these right away. Only if you're in a company that uses Redux should you really learn it. Like in Angular, use RxJS. Vue.js uses Vuex, so use NGRX. And RxJS actually is not the same as a state management system. It's like a set of tools that really help you. It allows you to think of your data as a stream, and you can kind of pipe it in different places and do manipulations of it and map it. So that's what this RxJS is. I would highly recommend if you're using Angular to learn RxJS because you're going to be a disadvantage if you don't. You can convert observables in RxJS to promises if you really don't want to use them at all, but that would be kind of silly because you're then not learning a very important piece of Angular and how it works. So I think these are all really nice to haves for these different frameworks. Obviously, different jobs, you may never even use Redux. And Angular, you probably definitely want to learn RxJS though. And then NGRX and Vuex is just really simple to learn. Modern CSS, style components. So once again, I think this is really a React. This feels very React heavy. Style components is only really in React. CSS modules you can do in React too. Style JSX, once more. This feels very React, but in modern CSS, like in Vue, you would have single file components or scoped components. In Angular, you would have components. All your components are also scoped. All your CSS styles are scoped to each component, but it's not really called styled components, I guess. I guess you can have this as a larger term. That means anytime your component has styles that are scoped to it. I don't know, like CSS modules. It's I don't really love this graphic here, but it's great if you're a React developer. Web components, HTML, templates. So I would say don't bother learning any of that. Just whatever convention of whatever framework you use, look at how they deal with CSS. Web components, HTML templates, custom elements, shadow DOM. I mean, these are terms that you really don't need to learn. I don't know. I know some companies are using web components. I would say this is very specific to certain companies that you work for, and it's not even worth really learning unless you really want to work for a company that does that. And no one's gonna. I would say that's very specialized. CSS frameworks, React Strap, Material UI, Tailwind CSS, Chakra. There's a whole lot more. And once again, this feels very React heavy, but in the Vue world, we have Vuetify, which would be one of them. We'll have, there's in the Angular world, we have several material design frameworks. I guess they mentioned Material CSS in here. But there's quite a few, there's dozens of these CSS frameworks for all the different frameworks out there for React / libraries, if you know, in React's case, out there. So this is just a short list, I would say. And once again, I wouldn't bother learning them unless the company I'm applying for uses them. I mean, there's so many out there. It's really hard to know which one to learn. I mean, maybe you could pick one good material design framework for your, React or Vue or whatever you're going for and know that. Testing your apps between unit, integration, functional, Jest, React testing library, Cypress, Enzyme. So in the Vue world, you would have probably Cypress, Jest. It's actually a Vue test utils is the kind of the equivalent to the React testing library. In Angular, they have their own. They basically it uses Karma, I believe, or you can use Karma / Mocha, or you can use Jest, I believe, in the newer versions. So Jest or Cypress are probably the ones you'd want to at least understand how to create test cases. Type checkers, Mocha, Chai, Ava, Jasmine. I don't think it's really a big deal that you'd have to learn this as a front-end dev right away. Just as long as you can make some basic tests. TypeScript, I would highly recommend TypeScript. I don't think I've heard too many companies using Flow, but TypeScript's a great way to do it. Progressive web apps, storage, WebSocket, service workers. This is all really nice to know. I mean, I would agree with the gray check mark, but it's not something you really should know right away. I mean, unless you really want to jump into the progressive web app world. Server-side rendering for React. You have Next and After.js. I guess there would be Gatsby in here somewhere too, but I don't see it. Angular, they have Angular Universal. Vue.js has Nuxt, and GridSum probably would be the other one you'd want to look into. And there's more stuff coming out all the time. I'm a big fan of Nuxt, so that's the one I would recommend. And I would probably put a purple check mark there. I think if you're in the Vue world, there's a lot of Nuxt apps out there. GraphQL, Apollo Relay. I think this is a little old. I think someone actually pushed up a pull request that had a much better GraphQL design to it. I think between GraphQL and REST, there's still more REST. So that's more of a backend thing, but just knowing how to connect and talk to a RESTful interface from the front end is, essential. I don't think you really need to know GraphQL. I agree. It's more of a gray check mark. Static site generators, Next.js. Okay, so they have Gatsby here. They have GridSum, so they have ViewPress. So this is pretty accurate of what you want to do. Static site generators. I would say Next.js should be yellow. It's really important to know, and I'd say GridSum as well, especially if you're in the Vue ecosystem. There is one on the Angular side, and I can't remember the name of it, but there is one on the Angular side, and I think in Angular Universal you can also generate a static site. Desktop, Electron, WebAssembly, and just keep learning. So this is the front end. Let's take a quick look at the back end. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the back end. And so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quicker because I think most of you guys listening are probably focusing most on the front end. And that's sort of what I think is the best way of going about learning web development. Is really the front end, I think, is probably the easiest starting point for most people when they're trying to get into web development, because you can create something and you can see it working and it's right in front of you. It's very visual. So if you're a visual person and you like designing, CSS, and this is a perfect way to start is the front end. Backend gets a little bit more technical. I mean, not to say you can't start off as a backend developer, but I think it has a higher bar. And if you disagree with me, leave a comment below and let me know why I'm wrong. So once again, they talk about internet and basic front end knowledge. I'd say the internet, having more internet knowledge is extremely helpful when you're working with the backend, because most jobs you're probably going to be doing things like creating RESTful endpoints, creating endpoints for the front end to hit, and then being able to take information and putting it into a database. A lot of times we call it CRUD. So you're basically creating, reading, updating, and deleting data that comes from some external source, oftentimes the front end. So having more internet knowledge, I think, is an absolute must. While in the front end, I think it's a nice to have some basic knowledge, but you probably want to know it much more on the back end. OS and general knowledge, like how the OS works, process management, threads, memory management. I don't really think, it just depends on the technology you're using. Maybe if you're using something that, like if you're creating your own VPN server, VPS, virtual private server, and you have to worry about setting up Apache and your web server and all the technologies, then you may want to know a lot about OS and general knowledge. However, modern day web development, we don't need to know nearly that much, because there are services like Heroku or AWS Amplify or Google Cloud Engine or the whole Lambdas and serverless functions which it really takes, or platform as a service. These are all terms you may hear that really abstracts out the information you need to know to run them, so you can just take code and put it on the back end without having to worry about getting updates for your web server or having to deal with outages, because it just does the whole platform service for you. So I don't think this as important. I don't even know if I would put a purple check mark there. Personally, I'm a huge command line fan, so I think learning the command line is a must, though. I will say you need to know how to go through the command line. I don't know about knowing all the difference between grep, awk, and sed. In my day-to-day, I use grep, awk, very rarely sed, curl, wget, tail, head, less, find, ssh, kill. I think most of these I use probably not as much sed and awk, but I would say it's not necessarily a must-have. I would say you have to know some terminal commands to get around. Rust, Go, Java, C#, PHP, JavaScript, Python, Ruby. I think Elixir probably would be a nice one to have in here. And from there, you can use frameworks like Phoenix to create your app. I think this is definitely not an exclusive list. Ruby with Ruby on Rails, you would use that. I don't know. These, I would recommend that you learn JavaScript as well. I think that's my favorite, but I wouldn't put down Ruby with Ruby on Rails. I think those are really popular along with C# and .NET. C# with .NET and Java. I think all those are, I think you should probably put .NET here. And then I think those would be the ones I would go through. JavaScript, Ruby on Rails, .NET, Java, and maybe even Python, but pick one of those. I think you'll be good with any of them. Definitely Ruby or JavaScript if I had to pick between two. So version control systems, basic usage of Git. I think those are all really important for backend knowledge. Relational databases, you're definitely going to have to know at least one nowadays to be really a good backend developer. At least you don't have to be great at architecting your app. A lot of times there's someone called a DBA that might actually do that part, but you should at least know how to do queries, how to connect to it. I think PostgreSQL or MongoDB, I think both of those are what most companies use nowadays. More about databases, ORMs, assets, transactions. These are really nice to haves. I don't think they all need to be purple check marks that you have to know all this unless you're like a DBA. I mean, just knowing how to query the data and grab it out, and then maybe knowing how to make it a little bit fast, maybe understanding a little bit what normalization is fine, but this is definitely not something you would have to know. More about database replication, sharding strategies. Once again, that's more if you're like a DBA, you would do that stuff. Learn about APIs, HateOS, authentication and authorization. And then to that point, I would say JWTs, OAuth, basic auth. I would say I would agree with this. Those are probably the definitely things you want to learn as a backend dev right away. JSON APIs, and I don't know gRPC. I don't think that's really. I've never been at a company that's used that. So leave a comment below if you disagree with me. But I think JSON APIs and SOAP are probably what most of companies use for talking back and forth as a protocol. Like using the JSON API. Caching, CDN, service client size, Redis. I would agree with all this. If I don't know how much CDN knowledge you need to know, but I guess you'd be like how to get your information on a CDN or use something like CloudFront or whatever you're using. I guess that would be fine. You don't need to do a ton of that for backend dev, but web security and NB5 and why not to use it. SHA family, scrypt, bcrypt. I would say that if you're rolling your own authentication, that's kind of a bad idea. I would use kind of more of one of the off-the-shelf or a like OAuth or something that you don't have to worry about the implementation details of some of these things. There's whole identity providers out there that obscure all this away so you don't have to worry about taking everybody's password and hashing it and putting it into a database. I would personally go that way, depending on what kind of platform I was using, but I would try to obscure that out so I didn't have to do it myself. It's good to know how to do this if you're just rolling a fun project for yourself. But a lot of companies, they take security and password security extremely, they're extremely passionate about it, and you don't usually have to know hashing algorithms. I mean, your mileage may vary. Web security knowledge, I think definitely for the back end, this is something you would need to know, not necessarily as much on the front end. Testing used to be where almost everybody would test on the back end, and it wasn't as much testing on the front end. So this would definitely be something you want to be good at. Learning how to integration testing, unit testing, functional testing. He doesn't even have it broken down between all the different technologies. I guess there's too many different frameworks, but there's a lot of tools that like JUnit for Java, and there's tons of different testing tools that'll make this easier. And now he does dive into CI/CD, and once again, I think this is more of a DevOps thing. You probably don't need to know too much of it as a backend engineer unless your backend engineers have to deal with the CI/CD pipeline, which is the continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. So having, I don't know if that's really that important. Design and development principles, solid, KISS, Yagni, dry. You could probably say this is the same for the front end. I don't know why this diagram wasn't in the front end. You could say these really apply for the front end too. Don't repeat yourself. You ain't going to use it. Keep it simple, stupid. Some of the solid principles. Yeah, those are definitely things you can do in the back end and front end. It's more of an advanced feature. I mean, as for a front end when they're first starting out, just knowing things like don't repeat yourself is probably one really important one. You don't have to know all the solid principles, but I think as you get more farther on in your career, you should know them. Architectural patterns, monolith, microservices, SOA. I think definitely as you become more of an architect, you want to know these patterns. Not really something you need to know right away. I mean, usually when you're deep diving into a new project, these things are already set up for you. You're rarely going to ever have to be the guy that, especially in a new project, that has to decide, are we going to do a monolithic application? Or are we going to do microservices? Are we going to set up Lambdas? Usually those design decisions are already done for you. But if this is like an architect or you've been in the industry for many years, then this is probably something you need to learn really well. Different search engines, Elasticsearch, Solar. Once again, very specific to what company you're working on. Same thing with message brokers, if you're going to use these. Containerization versus virtualizations, depending on how sophisticated your organization is, they might have build patterns that create Docker containers, and you need to at least understand the basics of Docker. Just depends on the organization. I think learning Docker is great, and I think every developer should probably learn it. GraphQL, graph databases, WebSockets, web servers, building for scale, keep learning. So that's kind of my ideas of some things that you should learn for the back end, kind of a quick synopsis of what I think is important. Once again, when you get into these web servers and understanding mitigation strategies, these are things that you really don't need to know unless you're going to be like a DevOps guy. So let's take a look at the DevOps one. DevOps. Okay. Learn a programming language. I don't know why. I mean, you do have to know some programming for DevOps. I would probably look for a scripting language that you can easily use, like maybe something like more like Node or Ruby or Python. It would be nice to have that because you are going to have to know a little bit of programming for DevOps. Understanding different OS concepts, threads, sockets. Yes, I think for your DevOps, this is much more important than your backend. I think they had a similar graph like that. You should know a whole bunch of OS things. I think you definitely for the DevOps, you should be understanding this because you're probably going to be working with servers. You're going to be deploying servers and tearing down servers, and you should understand a lot of these things. What's funny, it mentions tmux and screen. I think those can be used by front end and back end developers. They're just a way to terminal multiplexers. You can open up multiple terminal screens at once. I use it all the time. I use screen and tmux. And then they're talking about more about OSs. His favorite looks like is SUSE, Debian, Fedora, Linux. I like Ubuntu, it looks at Ubuntu, CentOS, and Red Hat, and Linux. Linux, these are the different types. Yeah, whatever version of Linux you want to become great at, go for it. I think Ubuntu is probably one of the more popular ones. Okay, I'm not going to go into all this, but this seems like a whole lot of stuff you should learn for DevOps, and I do agree that this is a good roadmap, like learning Kubernetes, learning Docker, learning how to use different CI/CD tools like GitLab, GitHub Action, Jenkins. I think Travis and Jenkins. I think Jenkins is probably one of the most popular ones. Yeah, I don't see too much wrong here. I'm not a DevOps expert, but this looks pretty accurate. AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, those are all great ones that you probably want to know. All right, so that's it. I have gone through all the different DevOps, the back end and front end. I want to hear what you guys think. Do you guys agree or disagree with me? Leave a comment below. And as always, make sure you click that subscribe button. Peace.